They called her plain the way they called a Tuesday plain, not with cruelty exactly, just with the mild, careless confidence of people who believed they were simply stating facts about the world. Eleanor Voss had heard the word so many times it had stopped causing her pain. It sat in her chest like an old stone, smooth from years of handling. Heavy, but familiar. She could carry it. She had been carrying it since she was 17 years old, when Mrs. Partridge had leaned across the tea table at her mother's house and said, in a whisper that was not really a whisper at all, "The poor girl has none of her mother's looks, does she?" Eleanor had been sitting 4 feet away. She had heard every word. She had reached for another biscuit and pretended she had not. That was 7 years ago. She was 24 now, and the word had followed her through 7 London seasons like a quiet companion she could not shake. It followed her into ballrooms, into morning calls, into the pews of church on Sunday mornings, where the daughters of earls sat in their good dresses and glanced at her sideways. She had learned to walk with it. She had learned to smile with it. She had even, on her better days, learned to find it rather amusing. Tonight was Almack's. It was a Wednesday in March, and the assembly rooms were full of people dressed in their finest, saying things they did not mean, to people they did not particularly like, all in the service of being seen and remarked upon. Eleanor stood near the far wall with a glass of ratafia she did not want. The ratafia was warm. The wall was cool. The wall, on balance, was better company than most of the room. She had come tonight because her mother had insisted. Lady Voss was a small, energetic woman who believed very firmly in the power of persistence. "You simply have not been seen enough," she told Eleanor every season, as if Eleanor were a painting that had not yet found the right light. "You must be seen. You must be out. Something may still happen." Eleanor always nodded. She always came. She stood against walls at Almack's and held glasses of warm ratafia and watched the room perform itself. And she noted, with the dry private amusement that had become her closest friend, that nothing ever happened. She was watching the room now. There was Lady Harriet Fossey in yellow silk, laughing very loudly at something a young officer had said. The laugh was a little too long and a little too bright, which meant she liked him. There was Lord Pemberton near the card-room door, looking at his pocket watch with the expression of a man who would rather be anywhere else. There were 2 viscountesses near the pillar to Eleanor's left, their heads bent together, their eyes occasionally sweeping the room. She heard her name. She was not meant to hear it. They had not positioned themselves to be overheard. But the room had shifted in that peculiar way rooms sometimes did, creating a momentary pocket of quiet, right where Eleanor was standing, and through that pocket came the voice of the taller viscountess, clear as a bell. "Miss Voss? Oh, she is a perfectly pleasant girl, very quiet, very bookish, but entirely the wrong sort of chin for a duke, I'm afraid." There was a soft sound of agreement from the other woman. Then a pause. Then the taller viscountess added, "And not the kind of face a man remembers, is it? Such a pity. Her mother was quite handsome once." Eleanor set her ratafia down on the small table beside her. She set it down carefully, without any particular haste, the way a person sets down something they have finished with. Then she turned and walked in the opposite direction. She was not upset. She told herself she was not upset and, mostly, she believed it. The stone in her chest had not grown heavier. It had merely shifted slightly. She was familiar with the shift. She knew how to walk with it. She was looking for the least occupied corner of the room. There was an art to finding such corners at Almack's. They existed near the windows, or behind the larger arrangements of flowers, or in the narrow passage between the outer door and the supper room. Eleanor had located all of them over 7 seasons of careful research. She turned sharply to the left. She was looking at the window. She was thinking about corners. She was not looking where she was going at all. She walked into something solid. 305. She was not a small woman, and she walked with some purpose, and the collision was enough to knock the breath from her body. She put her hand out instinctively and found fabric. Good fabric, the heavy kind, the kind that cost money, and beneath it, something that did not move at all. She had walked into a wall, a remarkably warm wall that smelled faintly of cedarwood and something else she could not immediately name. She took one step back and looked up. The wall was looking down at her. It had eyes, dark gray ones, the color of the sky just before rain, set in a face that was not handsome in any easy or obvious way, but was the sort of face you kept looking at anyway. It was a serious face, the kind of face that had decided things. He was tall, very tall, the kind of tall that made other men in rooms feel slightly shorter without quite understanding why, and broad across the shoulders, and he was looking at Eleanor with an expression she could not immediately read. Then he said, "Miss Voss," not a question. Eleanor blinked. She became aware, distantly, that her hand was still pressed against the man's arm. She removed it. She took another step back. She straightened her spine, which was something she did when she was unsettled, and she said, with the careful composure of a woman who had been straightening her spine in ballrooms for 7 years, "I beg your pardon. I was not looking where I was going." "Evidently," the man said. There was something in the word, not cruelty, not amusement exactly, but the ghost of something that might have been amusement, contained very tightly, that made Eleanor look at him more carefully. She knew who he was. Of course she knew who he was. Everyone in the room knew who he was. James Alderton, the Duke of Crail, was the sort of man a room reorganized itself around without his doing anything in particular to cause it. He was 32 years old. He had a house in Mayfair, and an estate in Somerset, and another one in Scotland, that Eleanor had heard described as very large and very cold. He had a title that was 400 years old. He had, according to every conversation Eleanor had ever overheard, at any assembly in any season, the kind of prospects that made mothers close their eyes and press their hands together like women in church. He had, apparently, also been standing in Eleanor's path when she was not looking. "I did not see you," she said, which was true, and then added, because the words came out before she could stop them, "You are very large to have not been noticed." There was a silence. The Duke of Crail looked at her. His expression did not change precisely, but something in it shifted, the way the surface of a pond shifts when something moves below it. Then he said, "I have occasionally been told as much." "I imagine you have," Eleanor said. She was aware, even as she said it, that this was not how one spoke to a duke. She was also aware that she had just walked directly into one, like a person who had not been paying attention, which was probably not an ideal beginning either. The stone in her chest was still there. The ratafia was still on the table behind her, growing warmer. The viscountesses were still somewhere to her left. She said, "Forgive me, your grace. I was looking for a quieter corner." The duke said, "Were you?" "Yes." "You had not found one." "No," Eleanor agreed. "I had not. I found you instead." She paused. "Which is not the same thing." This time the thing that moved in his expression was slightly larger. It reached his eyes for just a moment, before he contained it again. He said, "No, I suppose it is not." Eleanor became aware that they had been standing in this narrow space for longer than was entirely conventional. She became aware that Lady Harriet Fossey had stopped laughing and was now watching from across the room with the bright, speculative attention of someone who has spotted something interesting. She became aware of several other pairs of eyes doing the same. She said, "Well, I shall continue looking." She moved to step past him. He did not step aside, not rudely. He did not block her path, but he simply remained where he was, large and unhurried, and said, "There is a quieter corner near the east window, behind the arrangement of white flowers." Eleanor stopped. She looked at him. "Is there?" "Yes. And you know this because you were looking for it yourself." "I know this," he said, "because I have been standing in it for the better part of the evening." Eleanor considered this information. A duke, standing alone in a corner behind white flowers for the better part of an evening. She said, "Why?" Most people, when asked questions this direct by someone they had known for approximately 2 minutes, became flustered or affronted. The Duke of Crail did neither. He simply looked at her for a moment and said, "Because it is quiet there." Eleanor decided that was a perfectly reasonable answer. She said, "Then I have displaced you. You walked into me," he said. Which is not the same thing. He was using her own words back at her. She noticed it. She thought it was possible he had noticed her noticing it. She said, without meaning to, "You heard what those women said about me." He did not pretend not to understand her. He said, "Yes." "The chin remark," she said. "Among others." Eleanor looked down at the floor for a moment. Then she looked back up at him. "It is not the worst thing I have heard said about me," she said. "In case you are feeling any discomfort on my behalf, I am entirely accustomed to it." The Duke of Crail looked at her with his steady gray eyes and said, "That is a very sad thing to be accustomed to." It was such a plain, quiet statement. He said it without drama, without the excessive sympathy that would have embarrassed her, without the awkward reassurance that would have required her to say something polite in return. He said it simply, the way you might say the weather is cold or the road is long, as if it were merely a fact he was observing. Eleanor found that she did not know what to do with it. She said, "Well," then she said nothing else, because there was nothing else to say that would not be either too much or too little. He said, "The corner near the east window is still available." She said, "Thank you." She went and stood in it for the rest of the evening. The white flowers were tall and smelled pleasantly of something she could not identify, and the window beyond them let in enough cool air to be comfortable. She watched the rest of the room from behind the arrangement and drank a second glass of ratafia that was, blessedly, slightly less warm than the first. She did not see the Duke again that evening, but she thought about him on the way home, sitting in the carriage while her mother talked about Lady Harriet's dress and Lord Pemberton's expression, and she thought about the way he had said, "That is a very sad thing to be accustomed to, simple and plain and without any decoration, like something true." She tucked the thought away and did not examine it too closely. 3 weeks later, she saw him again. It was at Lady Fenwick's musicale, which was held on a Tuesday afternoon in a house in Grosvenor Square. The musicale was pleasant enough. There was a soprano from the opera and a young man who played the pianoforte with real feeling. But the drawing room was warm, and the chairs were arranged very close together, and Eleanor had positioned herself near the back, where she could see the performers without being easily seen by everyone else. He came in 20 minutes after the music had started. She noticed him the way you noticed weather, not because you were looking for it, but because it changed the quality of the air. He stood for a moment in the doorway, surveying the room with the calm, unhurried attention of a man who was never in a hurry, because nothing could make him move faster than he chose to. Then he sat down. Not near the front, where the important people sat. Not in the middle, where the sociable people sat. He sat down 2 chairs to Eleanor's left. She did not look at him directly. She watched the soprano, who was singing something in Italian, and she was aware of him the way you were aware of a window when you were standing near one, by the slight change in temperature, by the quality of the light. After the 3rd piece there was an interval. People stood and moved and talked. The woman on Eleanor's right turned to speak to the woman on her left, creating a brief, accidental wall of conversation that left Eleanor inside it rather than outside it. The Duke of Crail said, "How is the corner near the east window?" Eleanor turned. He was looking at the performers' empty chairs, not at her. He said it the way you said things you had been waiting to say for a small amount of time, not urgently, but with a certain deliberateness. She said, "I have been back to it twice. It is a very good corner. I thought you would find it satisfactory. I also," she said, "tried the one behind the potted palm near the supper room. That one is less successful. There is too much traffic from people looking for sandwiches." He looked at her then. That almost amusement was in his eyes again, barely there, like a word in a language she was only beginning to learn. He said, "That is a useful observation." "I am a systematic person," Eleanor said. "Are you?" "I believe in research," she said. "One should not simply stand in whatever corner presents itself. One should evaluate the options." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have not thought about it in quite those terms." "Most people have not," Eleanor said. "They simply drift to corners out of habit or discomfort. I prefer to choose mine deliberately." The woman on Eleanor's right moved away. The temporary wall collapsed. Eleanor and the Duke were no longer accidentally private, and Eleanor became aware of several heads turning, several pairs of eyes landing on them with the particular interest of people who had not been watching, and were now, suddenly, watching very much. The Duke of Crail did not appear to notice, or, more likely, he noticed and did not care, which was a thing that required a particular kind of confidence Eleanor had observed but never quite possessed herself. The music resumed. They did not speak again. But the day after the musicale, Eleanor's younger sister Agnes came home from a morning call with a certain expression on her face, bright and careful at the same time, like someone carrying a cup that was very full. She sat down across from Eleanor at the breakfast table and said, "Mrs. Whitmore says the Duke of Crail was seen talking to you at Lady Fenwick's." Eleanor looked up from her book. She said, "We exchanged a few words at the interval." "A few words," Agnes repeated, testing the phrase. "About corners," Eleanor said. "We have a common interest in quiet corners of rooms." Agnes stared at her. Then she said, "Eleanor, Agnes, the Duke of Crail does not talk to people at musicales. Mrs. Whitmore says he has attended 3 musicales this season and spoken to no one except Lord Hadley, and Lord Hadley is his oldest friend." Eleanor returned to her book. She said, "He spoke to me at Almack's as well." Agnes's cup tipped over. "He, what? When? How? And what did you say?" "I walked into him," Eleanor said. "And then we discussed corners. And then he told me where to find a better one." She turned a page. "It was not a dramatic event, Agnes." Agnes sat back in her chair and looked at her sister for a long moment. Then she said, with the peculiar certainty of someone who was 21 years old, and therefore knew things, "Eleanor, I think he likes you." Eleanor said, "He was being polite. Dukes are polite." "Not that one," Agnes said. Mrs. Whitmore says he is famously not polite. She says he is the most reserved man in London, and that he spoke 7 total sentences at Lord Rutherford's dinner last month, and 3 of them were to the footman about the wine. Eleanor closed her book. She considered saying something further. Then she decided the conversation had reached its natural end, picked up her book again, and went to read by the window. She did not think about it. She thought about it a great deal. The 3rd time was at the Hartley Ball, at the very end of March, when the evenings were still cold, but the daylight was beginning to stay a little longer, stubborn as hope. Eleanor wore her best dress, which was a soft gray blue that she had always felt suited her better than the pale yellows and whites that fashion preferred, and she did her hair herself, because the maid her mother employed for such occasions had a heavy hand with pins. The Hartley Ball was grander than Almack's, and louder than the Musicale. The ballroom was enormous. The chandeliers were blazing, and the floor was full of dancers spinning in careful patterns. Eleanor found a corner, not behind flowers this time, but beside a tall window that looked out into the dark garden, and she stood there and watched the room. He found her within 20 minutes. She was beginning to understand that he was remarkably consistent about this. Other men drifted. Other men were pulled in 6 directions by obligation and society and the need to be seen in the right places, talking to the right people. The Duke of Crail moved through rooms as if the room were the obstacle, and he were the straight line. He came to where Eleanor was standing and stood beside her, and he said nothing for a full minute, and Eleanor said nothing either, and it was not uncomfortable. Then he said, "This window has a small crack in the lower pane. You will feel a draft in approximately 10 minutes. Eleanor looked at the window. Sure enough, there was a hairline fracture in the lower left pane, barely visible in the candlelight. She said, "You have also evaluated this corner. I walked past it earlier, and you came to warn me." He said, "You evaluated corners. I thought you would want accurate information." Eleanor looked at him. He was watching the dancers, his face in 3/4 profile, serious and still. She said, "That is a very considerate thing to do." He did not answer. He watched the dancers. Eleanor said, "Do you dance, Your Grace?" "I know how to dance." "That is not the same as doing it." He glanced at her then, briefly. "No," he agreed, "it is not." "I also know how to dance," Eleanor said. "I find it preferable not to. One must think too carefully about one's feet, and it leaves insufficient room to think about anything else." "What do you prefer to think about?" The question was direct and simple. Most people in ballrooms did not ask her direct and simple questions. Most people in ballrooms did not ask her questions at all, or if they did, they were the formal questions of social convention. "Are you well? How does your mother do? Have you seen so-and-so's new dress?" Real questions, the kind that wanted real answers, were rare at Hartley balls. Eleanor said, "Honestly, tonight I was thinking about whether hedgehogs are trustworthy." He turned to look at her fully this time. She had his complete attention, which was a significant quantity of attention. He said, "Are hedgehogs trustworthy?" "As a general species," Eleanor said, "they have an unpredictable quality. They are small, and they roll into balls when startled, which seems like a reasonable survival strategy, but it also suggests a certain fundamental self-containment. Whether a creature that's self-contained can be truly depended upon is an open question." The Duke of Crail was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I would argue that self-containment is not the same as untrustworthiness." "Wouldn't it suggest," Eleanor said, "a preference for solving one's own problems rather than accepting help?" "Or," he said, "it suggests that the creature has learned to rely on its own resources because the alternative was less reliable. Eleanor considered this. She said, "That is a more generous reading." "It is a more accurate one," he said. Then, after a pause that was just long enough to be deliberate, "I own a small estate in Dorset, where hedgehogs are fairly common. I have observed them over several years. They are, on the whole, consistent. Consistent animals are, in my experience, more trustworthy than inconsistent ones, regardless of whether they roll into balls." Eleanor looked at him. She said, "You are defending the hedgehog." "I am," he said, "providing evidence." The draft from the crack in the window arrived, exactly as he had predicted, cold against Eleanor's left shoulder. She shifted slightly. He shifted with her, placing himself between her and the window so that the draft fell on the back of his coat instead. He did this without comment, without making it into a gesture, without expecting acknowledgement. He simply did it, and then continued watching the dancers as if nothing had happened. Eleanor thought, "This is a very unusual man." She did not say this. She said, instead, "I will revisit my position on hedgehogs." "A wise decision," he said. They stood there for another half hour. They talked about a pamphlet he had read on agricultural reform that he had found poorly argued, and about a translation of Juvenal that Eleanor had read twice because the translation was so bad it had become interesting in a different way than the original, and about whether supper rooms at London balls were ever actually improved by the addition of lobster or whether they were merely made more expensive. It was the strangest and most comfortable conversation Eleanor could remember having at a ball. She went home and told Agnes nothing. Agnes found out anyway, because Agnes always found out. By the following Thursday, she had assembled a collection of second-hand reports from 3 separate morning calls, and she sat down across from Eleanor at breakfast with the air of a person presenting evidence. "He stood next to you for 45 minutes, she said. "We were having a conversation," Eleanor said. "He moved you away from a drafty window. He mentioned the draft, yes." "Eleanor," Agnes put both hands flat on the table, "he has spoken to you 3 separate times, at 3 separate events. He has not spoken to any other young woman with anything resembling this degree of sustained interest. Mrs. Whitmore is beside herself. Lady Pemberton has apparently told her daughter to contrive a meeting. Lady Pemberton's daughter is very accomplished," Eleanor said. "You are not listening to me." "I am listening to you very carefully," Eleanor said. "I simply do not believe that speaking to someone at 3 social events constitutes a declaration of interest. People talk to people, Agnes. It is what people do at balls and musicales." "He talked to you about hedgehogs," Agnes said. "He did. He was very well informed on the subject." "Eleanor." Agnes's voice had gone quieter. The brightness in it had settled into something more careful, more gentle, the way the air settled after a window was shut. "I only want you to be careful," she said. I know that you do not allow yourself to hope for things. I know you have decided to expect very little from seasons and balls and all of it. And I understand why you have decided that. I am not criticizing you for it. But I do not want you to be so careful that you dismiss something real because you are afraid of being wrong." Eleanor looked at her sister. Agnes was 21, and she had her mother's good looks, and she had always understood things that Eleanor took longer to arrive at. Eleanor said, "I appreciate that." "But," Agnes said. "But I am being sensible," Eleanor said. "And sensible is not the same as afraid." She was, at least partly, afraid. She did not examine this too closely. She was good at not examining things too closely. She had learned, over 7 seasons, that the things you examined too closely had a way of becoming either very large or very painful, and it was better to carry them quietly and go about your business. She went about her business. She read her bad Juvenal. She attended her calls. She went to the 2 remaining assemblies of the season. He was at both. At the first, they discussed the architectural merits of Italian churches versus English ones, and he argued, quietly, consistently, with the same hedgehog-defending energy, that English churches were underestimated on account of their association with damp. At the second, they had a disagreement about whether the 3rd book of Juvenal's satires was the most interesting or merely the most argued about, and Eleanor said it was both, and he said that was not a position, and she said it was precisely a position. It was just a position that contained more than one idea, and he looked at her with those steady gray eyes and said that he supposed she might be right. She was almost certain he did not think she was right. She was also almost certain that he had enjoyed the argument. At the end of the second assembly, he said good night. Just that. Good night, Miss Voss. And then he walked away through the room, and the room reorganized itself around him as he went, and Eleanor watched him go and then looked back at the wall and thought, very quietly, "Do not do this, Eleanor." She was not sure what this was. She was fairly sure she was already doing it. The season ended. The families went to their country estates. Eleanor went with her mother and Agnes to her mother's sister's house in Wiltshire, where the garden was very large and the library was excellent, and Eleanor spent 2 months reading things she actually wanted to read and walking in the evenings and going to bed at sensible hours. It was the part of the year she liked best. She thought about him sometimes. She was honest enough with herself to admit that. She thought about the conversation about the hedgehogs. She thought about the way he had moved without comment, placing himself between her and the draft. She thought about him saying, "That is a very sad thing to be accustomed to, plain and direct, without performance." She thought, "A man like that does not seek out unremarkable women at 3 separate social occasions by accident." And then she thought, "But a man like that is a duke, and you are Eleanor Voss." And the Viscountess was not wrong about everything, even if she was wrong about the chin. The stone in her chest was the same weight it had always been. She carried it through Wiltshire, and into September, and out the other side. The next season began in February. Eleanor's mother had secured vouchers for Almack's again. She always managed it somehow, through a combination of persistence and good manners, and there was a round of calls and dinners to attend in the first weeks. The usual re-establishment of connections, the usual sense of London reassembling itself from its country pieces. On the second Tuesday in March, there was a house party at Lord Fenwick's estate in Hertfordshire. It was a modest party by the standards of such things. 15 people, 4 days, a great deal of walking in the mornings and cards in the evenings. Eleanor's mother had angled for the invitation because the Fenwick family were well connected and because Agnes was now firmly out, and it was time to think seriously about Agnes's future. Eleanor packed her books. She always packed her books. The Duke of Crail was also invited. Eleanor learned this when the carriage pulled up at Fenwick Park, and she saw him already there, standing on the front steps with Lord Fenwick, talking with the focused, unhurried attention he brought to everything. He was wearing riding clothes, which meant he had ridden from wherever he had come from, and he looked, she noticed this without meaning to, the way you notice the sun when it came out from behind a cloud, exactly the same as he had looked at the ball and the musicale and Almack's. Consistent, like a hedgehog. She almost laughed at herself. He saw her get out of the carriage. She could not read, from the distance of the front steps, what his expression did in that moment. She simply noticed that he looked, and that the looking was steady and deliberate, and then he returned to his conversation with Lord Fenwick. The first 2 days of the house party were pleasant. The mornings were bright and cold, and the walking was good, and the dinners in the evenings were warm and long. Eleanor talked to Lady Fenwick about gardens, and to a Colonel Marsh about his time in Portugal, and to a very young man named Mr. Tillery, who was nervous and talked too fast about hunting, until Eleanor asked him about his dog, at which point he slowed down and became interesting. Agnes, she noted, was being very capably entertaining at the far end of the dinner table. Good. She did not spend particular time near the Duke. She did not avoid him either. He was simply there, in the way that large, solid things are simply there, and she moved through the party alongside his presence, without directly seeking it out. On the third morning, she went out walking alone. The others had organized a ride, and Eleanor did not ride. She had learned 2 years ago but had never enjoyed it, and Lady Fenwick was occupied with household arrangements, and her mother was resting. Eleanor put on her warmest coat and her good boots and went out through the garden and into the long field behind it. The field was quiet. The sky was a very pale blue, the kind of blue that made the whole world seem clean, and there was a slight breeze that was cold, without being unkind. Eleanor walked down the long path between the bare hedgerows and breathed the cold air, and felt, as she always felt on good mornings in open spaces, like herself. She had been walking for perhaps 20 minutes when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned. The Duke of Crail was walking down the path. He was alone. He was wearing a dark coat and no hat, and his dark hair was slightly disarranged from the wind, and he walked with that straight, unhurried stride she had come to recognize, the walk of someone who was not trying to get anywhere faster than they chose to go. He reached her. He fell into step beside her without asking. She had noticed that he rarely asked for permission to do things that were not, in themselves, unreasonable. He simply did them, clearly and quietly, and let you say something if you objected. She did not object. They walked for a while without speaking. The hedgerows went past. A bird flew overhead, fast and dark and gone. The path curved gently to the right, and the house disappeared behind the hill. Then he said, "I have been trying to work out what you think of me." Eleanor kept walking. She said, after a moment, "What do you mean?" "Exactly what I said," he replied. "You are a difficult person to read, Miss Voss. You are clever, and you speak plainly, and you listen carefully, but you do not give much away. I have been trying to determine, over the course of several conversations, what it is that you actually think." Eleanor said, "Of you specifically? Of me specifically?" She considered this. She said, "I think you are very tall." He was quiet for a moment. Then, very quietly, he said, "Yes, I am. And I think," she said, "that you are unusually consistent, which is a quality I respect, and that you have strong opinions about hedgehogs and juvenile and Italian churches, and that you think before you speak, which most people do not do, and that you are," she paused, "kind," she said, "in a way that is not showy, in a way that is just practical." She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. They were standing in the middle of the field with the pale blue sky above them and the empty hedgerows on either side, and Eleanor looked at the ground in front of her, because it was easier to say things honestly when you were not directly meeting anyone's eyes. She said, "That is what I think of you." He said, after a silence that was longer than his usual silences, "Then I am glad." She looked up at him. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not the contained, almost amusement, not the steady assessment, but something quieter and more serious, something that sat underneath all the other expressions she had learned to read and was only now becoming visible. He said, "I mean to speak to your father." The words were plain. 5 words, simply arranged, with no performance around them. Eleanor heard them. She understood what they meant. Her mind did the translation cleanly and completely in about half a second, and then the thing that happened in her chest was not the stone shifting. It was something else entirely. Something she had no practiced name for. Something that had no smooth surfaces, because it had never been handled. She said, There must be some mistake." He looked at her, not unkindly, not impatiently, with the same steady patience he brought to everything. He said, "There is no mistake." "Your Grace," she said, and her voice was very level, very measured, the voice she used when she needed to be measured. "You are a duke. Your family is one of the oldest in England. Your estate in Somerset alone is, I have heard it is very considerable. And I am the youngest daughter of a minor baronet, with no fortune and no connections of any use to you. And the viscountesses at Almack's are not entirely wrong about Miss Voss," he said. She stopped. He said, "I am aware of my own circumstances. I am also aware of yours. I have been aware of both for some time." "Then you know." "I know," he said, "that you are the most honest person I have spoken to in 3 years in London. I know that you think clearly. I know that you are kind to people who are nervous, which is a quality rarer than it has any right to be. I know that you read bad translations twice, because you find them interesting in a different way than the original, which is the action of a person who takes pleasure in thinking." He paused. "I know that you carry something heavy," he said, "and that you have been carrying it for a long time, and that you do it with more grace than you would ever take credit for." Eleanor looked at him. The pale blue sky was very large above them. The cold air moved through the hedgerows with a quiet sound. She was aware that her heart was doing something she could not fully account for. She said, finally, "My chin is entirely unremarkable." He looked at her for a long moment. Then James Alderton, the Duke of Crail, did something Eleanor had never seen him do in any ballroom or musicale or drawing room in London. He smiled. It was not a large smile. It was not the bright, performed smile that people wore at social occasions. It was quiet and genuine and slightly crooked at the corner. And it changed his face entirely. And Eleanor thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she would do a great deal to see it again. He said, "Your chin is perfectly adequate." She laughed. She had not been expecting to laugh. It came out before she could be dignified about it, genuine and helpless, and she put her gloved hand over her mouth, and he was still smiling that small, quiet smile, and it was the strangest and most ordinary moment she had ever stood in the middle of. She said, when she had recovered, "That is the least romantic thing anyone has ever said to me." "I was not," he said, "trying to be romantic. I was providing an accurate assessment." "You," she said, "and your assessments." "You," he replied, "and your corners." They stood there for another moment in the cold field, with the pale sky above them. Then Eleanor said, "You truly mean to speak to him?" "Yes." She looked at him. She thought about 7 seasons and warm ratafia, and walls that were better company than rooms. She thought about corners, and hedgehogs, and the draught from the cracked window pane, and the way he had said that is a very sad thing to be accustomed to, without any decoration around it. She thought about the stone in her chest, which had been there for so long she was not sure she knew how heavy it was anymore. She said, I would I would not object to that. He nodded. Once, clean and definite, the way he did everything. They walked back to the house. She told no one. She went to the library after luncheon and sat with her Juvenal and could not read a single line of it, and she sat there for an hour, staring at words she had read twice before, and thinking about perfectly adequate, and the smile and the word yes, which was somewhere in her future, waiting for her to catch up to it. Lady Voss found out before dinner. Eleanor was not entirely sure how. Her mother had a way of finding out things that surpassed ordinary explanation. But she came to Eleanor's room in the hour before they dressed, and she sat down on the edge of the bed, and she looked at Eleanor with an expression that contained several emotions simultaneously in the way her mother's expressions often did. She said, "Eleanor." Eleanor said, "Mother." The Duke of Crail spoke to Lord Fenwick today. About speaking to your father. Eleanor said, "Yes." Her mother was quiet for a very long moment. Then she said, "Why did you not tell me?" "It only happened this morning," Eleanor said. Eleanor. Her mother's voice had changed. It was softer, and Eleanor was not sure she had ever heard precisely this softness before. "Do you want this?" Eleanor looked at her mother. She said yes. Her mother pressed her lips together. Then she said, something Eleanor had not expected, "I am sorry." Eleanor frowned. "For what?" "For all the years of telling you to simply be seen. As if being seen were the only thing that mattered. As if you only needed to be in the right room." Her mother looked at her hands. "You were always in the right room," she said. "You were always the right person. I should have told you that more often." Eleanor looked at her mother, who was small and energetic, and who had believed very firmly for 24 years that persistence was the answer to all things. And she said, "You told me what you believed." "I believed the wrong things sometimes." "You believed them because you loved me," Eleanor said. "That is not the same as being wrong." Her mother reached over and took Eleanor's hand. She held it for a moment. Then she stood up, and she straightened her back, and she said, in a voice that was back to being practical and efficient, "Well, we should dress, and you should eat something at dinner, because you will not have eaten at luncheon." Eleanor said, "I had some soup." Eleanor, and bread. Her mother gave her a look that she had been giving her for 24 years, the look that said, "I know you, you cannot fool me," and went to the door. At the door she stopped. She said, "He has good eyes." Eleanor said, "He does." "Clear," her mother said. "The kind of eyes that do not promise things they do not intend to do." She nodded, as if confirming this to herself. "Good," she said, and left. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the wall. Then she picked up her Juvenal again, and this time she read 3 pages without stopping, and they were not particularly good pages, but they were pages, and they led forward into more pages, and she thought, somewhere underneath the words, that this was perhaps how hope worked. Not as a sudden arrival, but as a gradual forward movement, page by page, into what came next. The next morning, the Duke of Crail sent a note to her father's house in London. Her father replied within the day. Eleanor was sitting in the morning room at Fenwick Park with Lady Fenwick when the message came. The Duke brought it to her himself, which was not the usual way of doing things, but was, she was coming to understand, entirely characteristic of him. He came into the morning room, and Lady Fenwick looked up, and he said, "Forgive the intrusion," in a tone that suggested he was not particularly concerned about interrupting, and handed Eleanor a folded note. She opened it. Her father's handwriting, which was untidy and slanted to the right, said, "Your mother has written me 6 times this week. I understand I am to expect a visit from the Duke of Crail. Tell him Tuesday is convenient, and tell him I shall have questions about the Scottish property, because I have heard it is very cold." Eleanor put the note down. She said, "Tuesday is convenient." The Duke said, "I will be there on Tuesday." Lady Fenwick, who had been watching all of this with the bright, controlled expression of a woman exercising enormous social discipline, said, "How lovely." Then she picked up her embroidery and bent over it with tremendous focus. Tuesday arrived. Eleanor did not see the conversation between the Duke and her father because conversations of that kind were not ones she was present for, but she heard it second-hand from Agnes, who had been listening from the hallway, which was the sort of thing Agnes had always done and would probably continue to do for the rest of her life. Agnes said the Duke had been in the study for 40 minutes. Agnes said their father had indeed asked about the Scottish property. Agnes said the Duke had answered every question without apparent discomfort and had not, as far as she could tell, given any of the conventional speeches about prospects and connections and the honor of the match. Agnes said he had said at one point that Eleanor was the clearest thinker he had encountered in years of conversation, and that he had found, in speaking with her, the kind of exchange he had not expected to find in London, and that he intended to spend a considerable amount of time having more of it. Eleanor's father, according to Agnes, had said, "She is fond of her books, mind you." And the Duke had said, "I had noticed." And her father had said, "She won't give them up." And the Duke had said, "I would not ask her to." After which, apparently, her father had poured 2 glasses of port, which was his way of concluding a satisfactory conversation. Eleanor, who was in the library when Agnes reported all of this, sat with her Juvenal open and not open, read and not read, and felt the stone in her chest do something it had never done before. It did not get heavier. It did not shift. It became, very slowly and without drama, slightly smaller, as if a piece of it had quietly crumbled away and left a little more room in the place where it had been. She had learned, over many years, not to name feelings too quickly. Naming them too quickly was a way of losing them. She left this one unnamed, and simply felt it, sitting there in the library with the bad Juvenal open in her lap, and the afternoon light coming in through the windows. He proposed in the library at Fenwick Park, because she had been using it. He had not planned it for the library, or perhaps he had. She was never entirely sure, because he was the kind of man who noted things like where the east window corners were, and where the draught came through the cracked pane, and it was not impossible that he had noted where she spent her afternoons. But it was a Tuesday in April, 3 weeks after his conversation with her father, and Eleanor was in the library at Fenwick Park, because Lord and Lady Fenwick had been kind enough to extend an invitation for a second visit, and she had brought her Juvenal, and she was sitting in the good chair by the window, with rain coming down the glass outside, and the afternoon very quiet around her. She heard the door. She did not look up immediately, because the Fenwick Library was generally regarded as Eleanor's in the afternoons, and people usually knocked, but no one knocked, so she looked up. The Duke came in. He saw what she was reading. A slight something crossed his expression, the same something she had learned to read in reverse, because on his face, amusement was the thing that disappeared, rather than the thing that arrived. He said, "The Juvenal." "The third book," she said. "I remain right about it." "The argument is still unresolved," he said. "I am the one with the book in my hand," she said. "I have the advantage." He came fully into the room. He sat down in the chair across from hers, the one that sat lower and faced the fire, the one that in a different kind of drawing room would have been the comfortable chair, and in a library was simply the other chair. He sat in it the way he sat everywhere, without apology, with the settled patience of a man who took up exactly the space he required. He said, "I spoke to your father 3 weeks ago." "I know," Eleanor said. Agnes was in the hallway. He looked at her. "Agnes," he said, as if filing this information. "She is very thorough," Eleanor said. He said, "I have been considering, since that conversation, the best way to approach this occasion." Eleanor set the Juvenal down in her lap, her thumb still marking her page, because she was not, despite everything, going to lose her place. She said, And I find," he said, "that there is no best way. There is only the honest way, which is to say that I have been looking forward to speaking with you since approximately the third conversation we had, and that I would like to continue speaking with you for the foreseeable future, and that I would like to do so in a context that makes it easier for us to have arguments about Juvenal without the constraints of social occasion." Eleanor looked at him. She said, "That is a proposal." "Yes," he said. "You have proposed marriage, using the phrase, the foreseeable future, and the subject of Juvenal. I have. And you are not going to add anything more conventionally romantic." He said, "If you would like something more conventionally romantic, I can attempt it. I should warn you that it will not be as accurate." Eleanor took her thumb out of the Juvenal, which meant she had lost her page, which meant she was not going back to it immediately, which was as clear a signal as anything she could have given. She said, "James." It was the first time she had used his name. She had thought about it once or twice in the abstract, in the way you thought about objects you had not yet been given, not covetously, just curiously. Saying it now was different from how she had imagined it. It was simpler. It was just his name, and he had it, and she was using it, and he went very still in the chair across from her. She said, "Yes." He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Good." And then, after another pause, "I am very glad." He said it the way he said all true things, plain and without ornament, like furniture that was well made and did not need to be decorated to be useful. Eleanor thought it was the loveliest thing she had ever heard said to her, and she thought it in full awareness that it was 2 words, and one of them was very, and one of them was glad, and she thought that if anyone else had said it, she would have found it insufficient. He stood up. She stood up. They were facing each other in the library at Fenwick Park, with rain on the windows and the fire behind him, and the bad Juvenal in her hand. He took her hand, the one not holding the book, and held it in both of his, in the plain, deliberate way he did things, not performing anything but simply doing it. He said, "We should tell your mother." Eleanor said, "Agnes may have already told my mother." He said, "Agnes was in the hallway again?" "Agnes," Eleanor said, "is always in the hallway." He looked at her with those gray eyes that had decided things, and for the second time, and still only the second time, he smiled, the same quiet, crooked, genuine smile she had seen in the field in Hertfordshire, the one that changed everything about his face. She thought, "Yes, I would do a great deal to keep seeing that." The letters arrived within the fortnight. They came from 3 different women, all of whom had Eleanor's mother's social acquaintance, and none of whom wrote to Eleanor directly. They were addressed to Lady Voss, and they were not unkind. Exactly, they were careful, the way well-bred people were careful, the way you could say something cutting, with sufficient courtesy, that the cutting part was deniable. The content was variations on a single theme, too quiet for a duke, too bookish, not the sort of connection one expected. Surely a mistake. Surely she had gotten ahead of herself. Too plain, one of them said, with the particular kindness of a woman delivering disappointing news to a friend. I am only saying what others will say. Too plain by half for a man of his position. Lady Voss showed Eleanor 2 of the 3 letters. Eleanor read them. She read them carefully, in the way she read things she wished to fully understand. She noted the phrases and the courtesies and the places where the writers had tried to soften what they were saying and had not quite managed it. Then she went to the fireplace. She put all 3 letters in. She had found the 3rd one on her mother's writing desk, which her mother had left openly where Eleanor would see it, which was Lady Voss's way of saying, without saying, I am angry about this, and you should know, and also, I did not hide it from you. And she watched the paper catch and curl and blacken and disappear. She did not make a speech. She did not feel the particular triumph she had imagined, once or twice, she might feel at a moment like this. She felt something quieter than triumph, and more permanent than relief. She felt the small, crumbled space in her chest where the stone had been, and she thought about the library and the rain and the smile and the word yes. Then she went back to the morning room and picked up her Juvenal. She had 3 more pages to go, and she intended to finish them before luncheon. Agnes found her 20 minutes later and sat across from her and said, You burned them. I did, Eleanor said, without looking up. All of them? All 3. Agnes was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Was that satisfying? Eleanor turned a page. She said, Less dramatically satisfying than one might hope, but sufficiently so. Agnes said, What did the 3rd one say? Mother's been guarding it. Much the same as the other 2, Eleanor said. Too plain, too quiet, a mistake, the usual assessment. And? Eleanor looked up. Agnes was watching her with those bright, careful eyes that had always, somehow, seen her more accurately than most. Eleanor said, And I am going to marry a duke who argues with me about Juvenal, and knows where the good corners are, and who smiled at me in a field in Hertfordshire in a way that I do not believe he had planned, and who said I was the clearest thinker he had encountered in years, and who proposed to me in a library while I was holding a book and did not ask me to put it down. She paused. She said, I think the assessments can see to themselves. Agnes looked at her for a long moment. Then she smiled. The bright, complete Agnes smile. The one that had always lit rooms more easily than Eleanor's own. And said, Good. The engagement was announced on a Friday morning in the papers. 4 lines in the social column. Clean and brief. Eleanor read it over her breakfast tea and thought it looked very small for something that had taken 7 years to arrive. Agnes read it and said nothing, only pressed her foot briefly against Eleanor's under the table, which was the sort of thing Agnes did when she had too many feelings to fit into words. Lady Voss read it 3 times and then went to write letters. The calls began that same afternoon. Women Eleanor had known peripherally for years, the wives of baronets, the daughters of earls, ladies who had spoken to her at assemblies with the mild, courteous inattention of people performing a social obligation, arrived at the Voss house in Mayfair with flowers and with interest that was new and specific and did not trouble itself to pretend it was anything other than what it was. They wanted to see her. They wanted to know what she was like, now that she had become someone worth knowing about. They sat in the drawing room and asked her questions, and looked at her with a searching attention she had never received from them before, and Eleanor received them all with the same composed politeness she had always brought to everything. And afterwards she sat alone in the morning room and thought, with the dry, familiar amusement that had always been her closest companion, that she was exactly the same person she had been the week before. She had not changed. The category they placed her in had changed. This was not the same thing, and she thought it was important to be clear about that, at least to herself. He came to call on Tuesday afternoons. This was the convention. A formal call, properly timed, with her mother present in the far corner of the drawing room, doing embroidery, with the focused intensity of a woman demonstrating that she was absolutely not listening. He sat across from Eleanor in the blue chair, and they talked, and her mother embroidered, and the clock on the mantelpiece ticked with great patience. He brought her a book on the second Tuesday. It was a new translation of Horace, which he presented without ceremony, saying only, "It is better than the Juvenal." Eleanor opened it, read the first page, and said, "It is not better. It is different." He said, "I expected that response." She said, "Did you bring it hoping to provoke an argument?" He said, "I brought it because you had read your Juvenal twice and would need something else to read." She looked at him. She said, "That is a very thoughtful reason." He said, "It is an accurate one," and then looked out the window with the expression of a man who had said something slightly more personal than he had intended, and was allowing the room to absorb it without further comment. Her mother's embroidery needle stopped moving for just a moment. Then it started again. On the third Tuesday he arrived in rain, which was unusual because he always rode, and Eleanor had assumed he would cancel. He did not cancel. He arrived damp at the shoulders and with his hair worse than it usually was, and he sat in the blue chair and said, as if the rain and the damp and the not canceling were perfectly ordinary, "I was in the neighborhood." Eleanor said, "You live in Mayfair." He said, "I was passing through." She said, "Passing through from where?" He said, "Somerset." She looked at him. His Somerset estate was a day's ride away. She said, "You rode from Somerset in the rain." He said, "The rain began en route." She said, "And you continued." He said, "I had said I would be here on Tuesday." There was a silence. Her mother had gone very still at her embroidery, and then, with tremendous tact, murmured something about checking on the tea and left the room entirely, which was not conventional, but was, Eleanor thought, exactly right. She said, "You did not have to." He said, "I know." She said, "You are damp." He said, "I am aware." She said, "I will have someone bring you dry things." He said, "That is not necessary." She said, "You rode from Somerset in the rain, to arrive here on a Tuesday, as you had said you would. I am going to have someone bring you dry things." He looked at her. For a moment the almost amusement was in his eyes, and beneath it something else, something warmer and more careful, the thing she was learning to look for in the spaces between his usual expressions. He said, "All right." She sent for dry things. He changed, because the Voss household contained her father's things, and her father was also a tall, broad-shouldered man, though not quite so tall. He came back to the drawing room in her father's coat, which was slightly short in the sleeve, and Eleanor thought this was the least ducal she had ever seen him look, and she thought it was entirely possible he was more himself in her father's slightly short coat in the rainy drawing room than he had been in any ballroom she had ever seen him in. She said, "Better." He said, "The sleeve." She said, "I know. You may choose to roll it up." He rolled the sleeve up with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a man solving a small problem, and then he sat back down in the blue chair and said, "Now, the Horace." They argued about the Horace for an hour and a half. Her mother returned after 20 minutes with tea, and sat in her corner, and embroidered in the content silence of a woman who had gotten exactly what she wanted. Agnes appeared in the doorway at one point, looked at the scene, Eleanor, the Duke, the tea, the Horace open on the table between them, and then disappeared again with the expression of a person who had confirmed something. Eleanor's father came home in the middle of the argument about the fifth ode and settled himself in the other corner chair with his newspaper, listened for a few minutes, and then said, without looking up from the paper, "She is right about the fifth ode. I have always thought so." The Duke said, "I am not certain the translator did justice to the original at that point." Eleanor's father said, "He did not," and turned a page. Eleanor caught the Duke's eye across the table. Something moved in his expression. That contained thing, the ghost of what would be a smile in anyone else. And she thought that her father, who had spent 24 years in proximity to Eleanor's particular way of thinking and arguing, might be the most useful advocate she had ever inadvertently acquired. He stayed for dinner. This had not been planned. Her father asked at the precise moment when asking would be most naturally received, and the Duke accepted with the unhurried directness he brought to everything, and Agnes rearranged the place settings with a speed and satisfaction that was impressive even by her own standards. It was the best dinner Eleanor could remember. Not because anything exceptional happened. The food was ordinary, the conversation was the ordinary conversation of a family at its own table, but because he sat there at the end of it, with the ease of a man who had found the right place to be, and because her father asked about the Scottish estate, and he answered without defensiveness, and because Agnes made him laugh once, just briefly, with a story about a neighbor's escaped goat, and Eleanor thought she would keep that sound in some quiet part of her mind for as long as she could. After he left, Agnes walked past Eleanor in the hallway and said, very quietly, "He is good." Just that, "He is good." Eleanor said, "Yes." Agnes nodded and went to bed. The engagement lasted 4 months. Eleanor would later think of it as the strangest and most pleasant 4 months of her life. Pleasant not in the sense of easy, because there were letters to write and arrangements to make and 2 more conversations with the viscountesses of the world to navigate with composure, but pleasant in the way that things were pleasant when you knew where you were headed and were moving toward it steadily, one careful page at a time. She learned things about him in those 4 months that ballrooms had not shown her. She learned that he was genuinely interested in the management of land, not as a duty, but as a problem he found worth solving, and that he had opinions about crop rotation that were more detailed and considered than most people's opinions about anything. She learned that he did not sleep well in London and slept very well in the country, and that he had known this for some time and managed his life accordingly. She learned that he was capable of sitting in a room with her while they both read, without speaking, for an hour and a half, without it becoming awkward. She found this last quality particularly valuable. She also learned that he was remarkably interested in what she thought, not in the polite social way of a man showing courtesy to a woman, the way men at balls asked your opinion of the music and then did not listen to the answer, but in the genuine, focused way of someone who considered your thinking worth understanding. He asked what she thought about things and then listened to the answer, and when he disagreed he said so plainly, and when he agreed he said so with the same plainness, and when she said something that surprised him, the thing that moved in his expression was real and immediate and not hidden. She had never been listened to quite like that before. She was honest enough with herself to note that she liked it a great deal. She was also honest enough to note that she had not previously known, not with any certainty, that it was a thing she had been missing. She had thought, for 7 years, that she was entirely adequate company for herself, and she had been right about that. She had not known that there was a category of conversation she had not yet had, and that once she was in it, she would find it as necessary as reading. She thought, once or twice, late in the evenings when she was supposed to be asleep, that this was perhaps the strangest thing. Not the title, not the houses, not the fact that she was going to become a duchess, which was so unlikely that she still occasionally regarded it from a small distance to confirm it was real. The strangest thing was that someone had looked at her, at Eleanor Voss, who was quiet and bookish and had entirely the wrong sort of chin, and had found her worth returning to, over and over, in every room, without being asked. She thought about this in the way she thought about things she did not want to spoil, by examining too directly. She held it at arm's length, and let it be what it was. She was learning, at 24, that some things did not need to be understood to be kept. She was also learning, slowly and with some effort, to let herself have them. It was not a large wedding. It was not in St. George's, Hanover Square, which was where important weddings happened. It was in the slightly damp old church that Eleanor had gone to every Sunday since childhood, the one where the east window leaked when it rained, and the third pew from the front creaked, and the vicar had been saying the same 3 jokes in his sermons for 15 years. Eleanor wore her gray-blue dress. Her mother had suggested the white one. Eleanor had said she preferred the gray-blue. Her mother had looked at her for a moment, recognizing, perhaps, that this was a sentence that had already been concluded, and then said, "The gray-blue is very becoming." It was becoming. Eleanor had always known it suited her. He was already there when she arrived. He was standing at the front of the church with Lord Hadley beside him, and when she came through the door, he turned and looked at her in that deliberate, steady way he had, and Eleanor walked down the aisle of the slightly damp old church in her gray-blue dress and her own good sense, and she thought, I was right, about the corner, about the window, about the hedgehog, about all of it. She reached him. She stood beside him. The vicar began. The ring was plain gold. He had told her, when they had discussed it, that he had chosen plain gold because she struck him as someone who would find decoration unnecessary when the substance was adequate. Eleanor had said that she appreciated an accurate assessment. He had said that he had been giving her accurate assessments since March. She had said she had noticed. He had said good. The ring fit perfectly. Afterwards, outside in the June sun, while Lady Voss was talking to Lady Fenwick, and Agnes was talking to Lord Hadley, with an attention that Eleanor privately noted and filed away for future observation, Eleanor stood for a moment beside her husband and looked at the old church with its slightly leaking window. She said, "There is a draughty window in there." He said, "The east one." "Yes. I noticed it when I arrived," he said. "Of course you did," Eleanor said. He offered his arm. She took it. They walked down the church path in the June sun, and Eleanor thought about 7 seasons and warm ratafia, and walls that were better than rooms, and about corners and hedgehogs and one crooked smile in a field in Hertfordshire. And she thought that the plain stone she had carried for so many years had not disappeared. She was not sure it ever fully disappeared, but it had changed its weight, or perhaps she had changed what she was carrying it alongside, and the difference was enough. The assessments, she thought, could very much see to themselves. She held her husband's arm in the June sun and walked forward into the next thing, which was hers, and real, and had been, all along, exactly as possible as she had never quite allowed herself to believe.